Welcome to the latest episode of Conversations with Politics, where your host, Dr. Abdullah Yusuf, dives into the intricate world of nuclear geography with Dr. Becky Alexis-Martin. With her unique perspective, she illuminates how nuclear weapons and energy have shaped not just global politics, but also the landscapes and lives they touch. We hope you enjoy the talk, and please don't forget to subscribe to the channel.
Thank you so much, Becky, for making time for me today. Tell us a bit of your background, where you born and raised.
Thank you so much for including me. It's so exciting to be on your podcast, and a real privilege to have you share this space with me. I grew up in Birmingham and Luton, so I'm quite a city girl originally, both very kind of multicultural places, and both, have kind of inequalities, you might say. So from an early age, I was always quite aware of kind of the politics of migration, and the politics of things like poverty. And I guess that's one of the things that's led me to be, interested as a human rather than academic, in politics, for most of my life, really.
Any earliest memories about, the role your parents played? I mean, I'm always interested about, our memories about our own connections, like own families.
Great question. My earliest years were spent with my grandparents and my mum. I had a brilliant time with my grandparents. My grandfather, he's a photographer, an artist, and an inventor. And so it was an absolute pleasure to kind of grow up with him and, painting and drawing. And he's an incredibly creative man. Even now, he's in his early 80s now, 82, I think, and he's still painting, he's still drawing. And my grandmother, she's always been very politically aware and politically active. She's quite left-wing. She's a unionist, and she used to work for ACAS, the civil service, and she'd go out there and fight for workers' rights during the mining crisis, in regions like Staffordshire, where they were closing mines, closing industry over in Morsel. So I'm very lucky. I come from a background that isn't academic, but is very kind of, we have quite a lot of cultural capital, and quite a lot of awareness. I was always, we always watched the news together when I was younger. So, yeah.
So, when was that moment, when, this light bulb moment, your political awareness?
Probably during the Thatcher era. I remember sitting there with my nan, watching TV, and in the late 80s, early 90s as a child, and just kind of thinking, I'm sure we can have a better world, but I think I decided to become politically active and become a kind of political academic many years later. So I was originally, I trained as a scientist. So I've got a bachelor's in natural sciences. I majored in physics, geology, and Russian. So здравствуйте to those of you out there who are listening in Russian. And so I did my master's in environmental management. I did a PhD in computational geography, modelling the places and spaces that might be at risk of a nuclear event and looking at the outcomes of nuclear events. And I kind of had this light bulb moment during my PhD. I was sitting there, using these really sophisticated AI agent-based modelling methods, making this really exciting model. What we do is when we model, there's almost a politics of computer science, a politics of demographic modeling. We call our population, we call them agents. We don't call them people. We don't call them humans, they're agents, or they're the subpopulation. So I'll talk about this subpopulation or that subpopulation or another. And I was working with a numerical atmospheric modeling environment, which was originally developed for Chernobyl. And it's we're on name 4 now, because we call it name rather than numerical atmospheric modelling environment. Otherwise, that's quite big. When you're programming in a basement room as a PhD student, your mind starts wondering if you're somebody who's interested in humanity. And I started thinking about kind of the people who might have been affected during Chernobyl, the communities, their lives, what it was like for them now. In a way, this is quite close to my heart because on my father's side, my family are all Eastern European of various sorts. Obviously, the Soviet Union moved everybody about, but that's my heritage. And I guess that was the first time when the academic, that was also a little bit personal, became political for me. Because at the end of the day, when we think about things like the Chernobyl nuclear accident or nuclear weapons, so much of what predicates around whether we have accident, whether we have warfare, it's not about the technology, it's socio-political. At the end of the day, someone needs to press the button. Someone needs to not have the training they need for these scenarios to kind of unravel. And so for me, I'd say kind of my first provocation to political action and to politics as an academic would have been in the final year of my PhD. When I put down my PhD, thankfully I had an amazing PhD supervisor, Professor David Martin, OBE, and he was just like so generous and so amazing with his time. No relation, even though we share a surname, and he was just really open to ideas. And he said, yeah, you can put down your programming for a little while, put down the mathematics, and if you want to write a cultural paper, give it a go. And he was he's the director of the National Centre for Research Methods at that point. And so he sent me on some courses. He said, well, you'll need to train. You can't just write a paper, you've got to know what you're writing about. So he sent me on qualitative methods research training. And that was the origins of my first academic paper that I published in 2015 called The Chernobyl Necklace, which looks at the social, cultural and political implications of life for the women who worked as liquidators after Chernobyl, because there was a proportion of women who worked as liquidators, so they helped clean up after Chernobyl, and also local women and those who received excess radiation. Some of them needed surgery, some of them had thyroidectomies, and they called their scar the Chernobyl necklace. And so my paper had explored this kind of embodiment politics and kind of what it meant for the state that these women had done this work, had experienced this kind of moral injury, physical harm, and these long-term impacts. I'm thinking about kind of the meaning of choosing to call their scars from serving their country the Chernobyl necklace. So long story, but maybe an interesting one. So yeah.
No, that's brilliant. I mean, so it seems like, I mean, your work kind of intersected with like lots of things like geography, science, biology, chemistry, physics, and the cultural side. And also there's a kind of poet there as well. Even the name, is so poetic. It's like almost like, Greek tragedy.
Thank you. That's really kind of you to say. But it was the experience of working and kind of learning, working with and learning these women's stories that led me to kind of further become engaged with the political side of things, and to kind of to really think about the politics around environment, around the nuclear, and around these how these issues intersect from a global perspective.
Like, I mean, with me, like, I mean, I'm just trying to tell my own story as well. So like things like this kind of disaster, massive level, human cost. I struggle to watch any of these stories. So like lots of documentaries being made on like Chernobyl and then, other disasters. I actually never saw them because I don't have the courage to see them, and see the tragedies, how it unfolded on the people. But did you go to the ground as well to talk to the people?
Yes, and that's a hallmark of my work. I've travelled internationally to learn the stories of nuclear accident and also nuclear weapons test survivors. So I've worked extensively with the men who worked on the British nuclear weapons testing series, and produced a report that was filed during the Conservative government. At the House of Commons Library, that pushed for their recognition and medal, which of course they received from Boris Johnson after lots of fuss kicking up. And I've also worked very closely with the communities affected by the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, and written on their lived experiences, particularly the women. I've written on the experiences of the Hiroshima maidens, who were the women who received reconstructive surgery from the US, who of course dropped Hiroshima and Nagasaki nuclear weapons, and kind of explored that notion of politically saving face, and how these new technologies that they pioneered on their own soldiers, these women were some of the first civilians to receive these surgeries and what it meant for their life afterwards. I've done work very extensively in the Pacific as well, so that's kind of my main region really. And initially I was looking at the humanitarian and environmental issues arising in the region, and thinking about how we can support communities in the context of the Treaty for a Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But now my work is very much about decolonizing research and creating epistemic justice and ensuring that voices from the community are uplifted and heard. My latest reports and paper forthcoming all include Kiribati people as authors, and I translate all my work into a Kiribati to ensure that the community can receive it and enjoy it, and find it useful to them, not just in the colonial language. Beyond that, I do a lot of work around peace technology and future technologies in nuclear warfare. So I've been writing on this, thinking about things like nuclear reactor attacks as a regular warfare since about 2018. So it was a great shock to me, of course, to learn of the Russian attack and occupation of Ukrainian nuclear power stations. But at the same time, a book chapter I'd written, Future of Nuclear Warfare, Spaces, Zones and Technologies, had described this scenario in 2019. So I had this very peculiar experience of kind of almost deja vu when I learned about the Russian attack. This is something that is of interest, but also concern to me at the moment because of its unprecedented nature, because we have enshrined in the Geneva Convention, we do not attack nuclear power stations. We leave our nuclear installations alone, regardless as to who, as long as they're civilian, regardless as to who owns them. So it's a very novel and very concerning turn, I would say, in the nature of warfare right now.
There's like lots of things to unpack because these are so many technical stuff there. I just want to like three things I really love to know, like in a very simple terms, so that any random people can actually understand a simple way. So one is like nuclear geography, that one thing. I mean, because you are like you can call yourself as a nuclear geography researcher.
Yeah.
That's one thing. So that's one terminology I want to know. The second thing is like, can you just expand a bit more about the nuclear weapons versus nuclear power plant? Like, how these two things are, like which one? I mean, obviously nuclear weapons are, and we know like, how bad this can be, but at the same time, nuclear power plant, how bad that can be as well. I mean, I don't know much about this technicalities. So if you just unpack a bit, will be great for me.
No, these are really good questions. So for the first one, when I was doing my research, I realized that there was no kind of term to describe what I was doing. And so in 2016, I held the first Nuclear Geographies Conference at
Mm,
the Royal Geographical Society. And I thought nuclear geographies was a very apt term because geography is study of the earth and everything within it. It's culture, society, environment, place. And so nuclear geographies is looking at all nuclear issues and how they intersect, how they relate to society, how they relate to politics, how they relate to environment, from nuclear repositories to nuclear medicine, and everything in between, for better or for worse. To move on, to think about kind of nuclear energy versus nuclear warfare, I think it's really interesting because we wouldn't have nuclear energy without nuclear warfare. So our first nuclear power plants were developed as part of the nuclear military industrial complex. So they were a technology that was needed to produce the fuel for a nuclear warhead to create plutonium as a byproduct.
mm,
um, However, they've become a very good source of low CO2 energy.
mm,
So it puts us in a very interesting position because you can have obviously nuclear energy for purely civilian purposes. And we have this challenge that the energy they produce is high quality, low CO2, um, doesn't contribute to climate change in the same way as fossil fuels at all. It's actually quite good. Um, and so the challenge now is thinking about what do we do about the waste. So drawing on my kind of more geological and scientific background, I think that it is time really to begin to think about producing and implementing, deep repositories, and thinking about kind of how we can ensure that they're kept safe and secure. And I think the deep time issue is really interesting when we think about nuclear energy. We have amazing technologies at the moment that are being developed to kind of think about how we store and manage nuclear waste.
mm,
If we look over at Bangor, their Nuclear Futures Group is absolutely brilliant. If we look down at Bristol with Claire Corkill's work, Professor Claire Corkill is doing some absolutely amazing things. They're both physics groups, as you can imagine, and material science. But there's still very much a political, social, and cultural pushback
mm,
against nuclear energy. I would say, there's a desire not to have nuclear energy sites in new places due to kind of concerns about safety and environmental implications and consequences.
mm,
And also there's concern about kind of the siting of these long-term repositories where we might, put nuclear waste for millennia. And I think that concern is understandable because, of course, in the UK, like our science, you know, we 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 don't get educated on kind of the implications of things like nuclear energy when we're at school, when we learn, unless we go take a physics degree. And I think that the way that these installations communicate, they're getting
mm,
better, but they've got a long way to go to ensure that they have proper kind of public and political engagement.
mm, mm,
So my perspective is nuanced when it comes to nuclear energy. However, with nuclear warfare, I think we're in a really difficult situation at the moment. We've got the great powers, of course,
mm,
Russia, China, the UK, France, and India and Pakistan, of course, and the dynamics are changing so swiftly. And nuclear weapons have, obviously proven to be an imposition to kind of NATO getting in and ending the Russo-Ukraine war. This threat of nuclear warfare exists at the moment, I think, if we try and take action. But then we haven't used nuclear weapons since 1945 in warfare, although we've tested, you know, hundreds of them with grave consequences to the communities affected.
mm,
And when we look at kind of North Korea, when we look at Russia, um, the progress that was made during the second nuclear age, during the 90s, when it was kind of more peaceful, when we were disarming, appears to be diminishing, doesn't it? We're in this kind of far more volatile third nuclear age at the moment. And I think one of the big issues with nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, so let's say we don't use nuclear weapons, we do use nuclear energy. One of my great challenges, from a moral philosophy perspective, I'd say, is thinking about the chain of kind of supply of materials and processing. Because whether it's nuclear weapons or nuclear energy, it's a globalized process. You don't just kind of pluck your nuclear weapon out of the air, or, pick your uranium up in Cumbria and then pop it in a nuclear power station down the road. It comes from somewhere. And so, one of the things I think is really necessary if we're going to go forward with nuclear energy in an ethical way is we need to think about things like, for example, fair trade uranium. Sounds bonkers, but why not? Why aren't we thinking about who produces and supplies the uranium? Why aren't we thinking about uranium miners in the same way we think about coffee producers, right? In the same way we think about those who make our tea. Why don't we care? So one of the things I would really like to see in future is deeper contemplation of these kind of pathways for materials, the pathways to processing, and the lived experiences of miners. I worked fairly extensively on the Colorado kind of Cold War community, looking at uranium miners in Colorado and their lives and conditions during the Cold War. And I think there's so much that's kind of unseen and hidden, essentially, whether it's the uranium mining in the Yili Basin in China, whether we're thinking about Namibia, and whether we're thinking about Russia, which of course is this great source of security issues and contention at the moment. So I would love to kind of explore that more as well in the context of both warfare and energy.
Sometimes like we use this like term, the tragedy of the commons. So it seems like, this like nuclear energy, it's like more about the collective approach. I don't think individual country can, do it unilaterally. It has to have some kind of, serious global framework about the safety, about, safety from like every aspect of the structure, from like the people who are growing like uranium, or like from there, the whole chain system.
Definitely. And we have some structures in place. We've got legislation with the UN, and we've got the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, who inspect all nuclear installations internationally, exempting North Korea. But of course, the problem is with these international bodies and authorities and with these organizations, the nation state must permit and give space for these organizations to go in and do the inspection and, provide that information and support, and ensure that regulatory procedures are being followed appropriately. And if we return to another Cold War situation, prior to Glasnost, you can imagine, and that would put us at greater risk of future Chernobyls, because that space to inspect, that space to learn, that space to make sure that things are being done to a high standard might be compromised. So as far as my kind of perception of future risks is concerned, I don't think it will come to nuclear warfare with Putin, but I do worry for his nuclear energy workers and his nuclear installations, because when nuclear installations are managed and monitored well, they can run for decades without issue. If they are not managed and monitored effectively, if there's techno-scientific issues, then of course that's when accidents happen. So my concern for Putin is what's going to happen long term to his nuclear energy resilience and safety.
I mean, especially in the war is always a big trigger, isn't it? Because you don't control the ground, things can change on the ground, and suddenly you decide that, okay, what's the option? I mean, I can give you one example. Like, and I give this example to my students during the Korean War. There's a UN-led like some kind of peace mission, but it was like US U.S. operation in like Korean War. Um, the the commanding officer from that mission was General MacArthur. So he was like, 5-star general from the Second World War. So he was in charge of that operation. It was a difficult war. At one point, South Korea took over the whole thing. And at one point, North Korea also took over the whole thing. So General MacArthur was kind of panicking at one point when like North Korea, China, and other actors involved on the ground. And he actually came to Truman, President Truman, that things are tough. What can he do on the ground? And he was asking for like whether he will be allowed to use nuclear weapons in the Korean War. And Truman, I think that's like one of those moments in history. So what Truman did, he actually sacked MacArthur.
Yeah.
That's the end of like this 5-star general career. But at the same time, Truman himself used nuclear weapons on like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The other story is quite like, disturbing story. I mean, I sometimes feel like, the powerful countries are always, it's just different kind of mindset. They don't think much on ethics or humanity or other things. So like Truman, the day he actually bombed Nagasaki, I think that's like 9th of August or 8th of August.
Yes,
The
it is.
same day, actually Truman also signed and ratified the UN Charter. So basically ratified the UN Charter the same day. So basically he bombed Nagasaki and he asked his Secretary of State, can you bring the file and we can ratify UN Charter? I mean, that's bonkers, isn't it? The same day.
It is. It's kind of outrageous, really, and what an astonishing tale to share as well. I think I think it says a lot about politics, doesn't it? And about particularly American politics at the time, and perhaps a lack of self-awareness. So, thank you for sharing. No, it's it's very interesting.
So like that's why I always worry this like Russia-Ukraine war. There will be a moment like that, and I think Putin has got less constrained. He's just one man show. I mean, he can decide. What's your like? I mean, because this is a philosophical question, because we don't know what's happening in his mind or in his head. I mean, do you think about that?
Yeah, I do. Quite extensively, as you can imagine. I yeah, I find it deeply concerning how he's surrounded himself with those who are very very loyal to him, and how he hasn't really created space for any opposition. Well, he's destroyed the opposition, he's poisoned it. It's or it has mysteriously disappeared, or it has been imprisoned, hasn't it, invariably. And so I worry that because he's surrounded by sycophants, that there could be consequences. But then I do think that his military training, akin to British military training, means that if he did try to do anything that wasn't appropriate, some admiral or general hopefully would step in and stop him. So it's it's a very difficult time, though, isn't it? I really do feel as though we're kind of returning to the well, I say returning, I'd say in a way this is worse than the first Cold War, because of the volatility of Putin, and because of his aggression, open aggression towards the West after years of relative peace. So yes, it's a really difficult situation. My personal hope is that he becomes too infirm to continue leading, and then maybe somebody better will come into power. But even that can't be guaranteed when you look who might follow him. So,
I mean, we know some of the stories after nuclear bombs dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but obviously things and time changed. Things are much more sophisticated now, much more, lethal and like deadly. Can you give us some kind of picture of like, the minute after, what will happen if like a nuclear bomb drops somewhere?
Well, it depends on the size, but let's say that a hydrogen bomb was dropped. So you would have within the immediate blast zone radius, you'd have incineration and irradiation of kind of that immediate area. So within the blast zone, you would have very little surviving, and outside of the blast zone, you'd have exposure to ionizing radiation, and you'd have heat. You'd probably have wildfires from the from the blast as well. So it's very it's very frightening. There's multiple different mechanisms for harm, really. You've got irradiation, you've got incineration, you've got fires afterwards, you've got the pollution, of course, of ionizing radiation that may drift and may not, depending on the weather conditions, may not stay in the same place. And we know, obviously, from Hiroshima and Nagasaki that people who did survive, and it killed hundreds of thousands, both blasts between them killed hundreds of thousands of people. But those who did survive, many received life-changing injuries, and many who received high ionizing radiation exposure, they'd have what we call acute radiation syndrome, so radiation sickness. And this develops within 24 to 48 hours, and it affects your white blood cells, it affects your immune system, it can make your hair fall out, it can make you terribly ill, and it can kill you. In the short term, which is what we call the deterministic effects. And then in the long term, you've got what we call stochastic effects, which are things like your increased likelihood that you might get cancer when you're older. So one of the challenges faced by those who received a high radiation dose during nuclear weapons detonation in Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they, if they were near the blast zone, many of them became ill with cancer when they were older. So, so lots of different effects, both immediate, short term and long term.
Also, like they use some term called nuclear winter. Is it something like that? I mean,
yeah, so the Rand Corporation, Herman Kahn at the Rand Corporation, came up with the notion of mutually assured destruction in the 1960s, or MAD, as he called it. And it was this notion that if we started a nuclear war, we may not be able to finish a nuclear war because the priority of attacking would take precedent over the priority of survival of the human race. So one of the things I find very interesting, and one of the things I have modelled as a scientist, is the environmental and atmospheric impact of nuclear events. And if you get over a kind of certain, if you get over a certain amount of detritus in the atmosphere from the nuclear weapons, and over a certain amount of kind of heat and pollution generated, then you get what's called nuclear winter. And this is similar to, you can think about, you've also had a similar effect historically from very large volcanic eruptions. So in 1777, the Larky Fissure eruption produced so much atmospheric gas that it caused what we call little winter, right? And we had a longer winter. But with nuclear weapons, it's a far more pronounced effect. And this consequence of large-scale nuclear weapon use would very much be, a change in climate. And this change in climate could last several years with consequences such as crop death, issues with breathing and issues with kind of sunlight getting through, and the decline of humanity, essentially, because our planet would not be able to sustain us for that long without fresh crops, without food resilience, and of course there'd be pollution internationally, so radioactive pollution internationally. So yeah, this is a very good reason not to use nuclear weapons, is the potential for this escalation. And why some places such as China have a no first use policy. Unfortunately, other places do not. So yes, the US does not, Russia does not at this point in time. So so yeah, so there's that issue, and of course, whenever more than one nation state has nuclear weapons, the possibility of retaliative action increases.
Especially like, I mean, when you talk about nuclear geography, I mean, it doesn't comply with any border, or like, that this is the place I'm bombing, so it will stay there. It's not. It's like, so that's the main problem. The geography is so vast, and like if you're, I mean, the way I see, like, the normal war and the great war. So the great war is people cannot escape a great war. Everyone is in. Small war you can escape, like fleeing from the country. But so the way I see like nuclear warfare, that's a great war. Everyone is in.
It is, and you're right. One of the big issues is that ionizing radiation has no respect for borders or boundaries. So if we did have large-scale nuclear war, there would be very, very limited places for people to go. I know me and Dr. Tom Davies, using my modelling, we wrote a paper and article for The Guardian many years ago, 2017, looking at the safest places to go should we have nuclear war. Ironically, several of the places in the Pacific where nuclear weapons were tested came out as our best options, which of course have already been subject to nuclear weapons effects. So there's a lot of there's a lot of issues really that arise when we think about the potential for nuclear warfare, which is why I think the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is an exceptionally good idea, because not only does it provide environmental and humanitarian support through a trust fund that we're currently developing, it also obviously outlaws and prohibits nuclear weapon use, and it's had great uptake. There's 94 member states now this point in time, so we only hope that maybe more will sign up and more will ratify, and maybe a few of the nuclear weapon possessor states will someday renege and decide, actually it's not for us, actually we don't need this threat, we don't need this extra risk. So
It's such a vast topic area, but also it's so much politics as well. So the way things are now, we are living in a very volatile political landscape. So the American election is coming up. I remember, like, I think Trump administration in 2020, they pull out from INF, isn't it?
Yeah. And that was a really big issue. I think I was extremely concerned when he pulled out of that particular treaty, and he also threatened to pull out of New START as well. There was these two really big kind of pivotal treaties. One that prevents intermediate range missiles, the INF, and the other that encourages Russia and the US to decrease their stockpiles, which is New START. Both of them are in tatters, really. And I feel as though, Biden he's brought more peace to the US, but I feel as though he hasn't made as much progress on the Russia issue as I'd have liked to have seen him make. And I worry that Donald Trump is going to, wreak havoc, essentially. When we look at his previous presidency, he was exchanging volatile words with Kim Jong-un. He was buddying up with Putin, which is extremely concerning from a national security perspective. And so who knows what the future will bring. I mean, maybe I don't think he'll be the first president to rule from prison now, but I don't think that his agenda will be very peaceful, or offer many opportunities to create peace.
What are the possibilities? Like, I mean, USA, like, retract from that position. They can come back and then say that, we are part of INF. I mean, in terms of bureaucracy, how easy to pull out and how easy to get in again?
It's all reliant upon Russian cooperation, really,
Mm,
and I think that if the US is willing, it will take time to persuade Russia to participate. I don't think it's in Putin's interest at the
mm,
moment, and I think with his desire to present this kind of strongman macho image as well, any return to participation may be perceived as being. Um, as weakness rather than strength, which is a shame because, of course, his participation would, strengthen Russia geopolitically. It might even mean that Russia receives a few less sanctions and
mm,
has a greater political opportunity. Because it's very interesting at the moment. All of the kind of nuclear industrial establishment that previously relied on Russia is now being for like technologies that we used for power stations in Europe and that sort of thing. And it's now all being replicated elsewhere. So the US and Spain are currently in the process of working out how to design Russian parts for nuclear reactors, for example. So there's this big step away from Russia because of
mm,
its non-compliance. Because if it won't comply with nuclear weapons, nuclear weapons arms control policy to control nuclear weapons, then what's to say that it will do the same for nuclear energy? So it's having this dual impact.
mm. It seems like almost like, there's no leadership in the nuclear, this like industry. Because the way international law works, I mean, it's just all about, self-compliance. If you do it, then other will do it. If you don't do it, then other will say that, yeah, I mean, who cares? So it's like very much linked to this international law. The ethos of international law is like self-compliance.
I think this is one of the great difficulties, actually, is that, yeah, it's reliant upon the willingness to participate. And Nina Tannenwald, who's a great writer, has written about kind of the nature of the nuclear taboo through the lens of nuclear warfare. But I think it's equally applicable in the context of nuclear energy and this notion that actually we do comply because we don't want to be pariahs. We don't want to be outcasts internationally. From a perspective of kind of nuclear norms and energy and arms control. So to push back and so to refuse to participate with the IAEA, for example, it's both a cause for great alarm among the international community, but there are and also kind of more broadly as far as kind of how we understand nuclear issues is concerned. But the IAEA does have powers to go and kind of force inspections when push comes to shove, which is reassuring. And there's some very good remote sensing monitoring out there to kind of learn, what's happening and how energy and warfare are developing from afar.
Like, I mean, one of the things like you do like this, like with nuclear geography, this like nuclear testing sites. So like both US and Russia, I think they have got over 5K nuclear weapons or like nuclear warhead. So does it mean there are lots of testing involved here?
Historically, both Russia and the US undertook lots of nuclear weapons tests. So the US, let's talk about the US first, undertook their nuclear weapons tests in Nevada, in New Mexico, the Marshall Islands, and also Carissima in Operation Dominic, which is one of my kind of areas of expertise.
Mm,
Um, and those nuclear weapons tests varied from Castle Bravo to the Operation Dominic series. And, they tested hundreds of nuclear weapons to reach the point where they had kind of the current selection of nukes that they've got. And Russia as well undertook nuclear weapons testing across the Soviet Union, including Novaya Zemlya, which is in the far north of Siberia, and had indigenous communities local. local who weren't moved, and also in Kazakhstan in semi-Palatine polygon, where in total 456 nuclear weapons were tested between the 60s to the 90s. Communities were left in place, and they experienced long-term defects and health issues to this day, and also stigma as well. So they're referred to as mutants, those who live in the region, and they've tried to reclaim the term and be like, yeah, we are radioactive mutants, but we're getting out there and we're going to change things. And it's very interesting because as a result of obviously all the Kazakhstan nuclear weapons tests in this kind of atomic steps space, the Kazakhstani government have decided to become partners for the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So they're leading the next steps as we go forward for the third meeting of member states parties next year. So so both Kazakhstan and Kiribati are like really big to kind of try and push and create those changes and create that recognition and ensure that nuclear weapons are not used in warfare or testing again. There was the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, of course, in the 1990s, but as you very rightly said, just because you have an international treaty in place doesn't mean that anybody pays it any regard. So since then, there's been testing, of course, by North Korea in 2016, 2017 and 2019.
It's quite a bleak picture, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed. So yeah, it's difficult because the issue, of course, is that these policies are made for under the assumption that our leaders are rational actors and they're working with a democracy. And of course, we, like economics, the idea of irrational, it should have gone out the window decades ago with politics as well. Our leaders are not rational. There's a lot of the time they are irrational, emotional men who frankly probably shouldn't be in charge of anything as important as a nuke, and who make terrible decisions for their people based on their egos rather than their economies. So we have this ongoing fight, don't we, whereby this nuclear weapon, this icon of power, this with its tremendous destructive legacy and the harms that it has caused to whether it's scientists, military workers or local communities through deployment and testing, is then put in the hands of people like Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin, and then what can we do? So I think arms control is so important on a national and an international level, because that way, of course, hopefully there's some safeguards in place. With the US, at least there very much are safeguards in place. So Trump can't just kind of break out the ball and biscuit and press the button. But I still really don't like it. I still do not like it that he has that capacity, even for a chain of command, to unleash the war. It's we live in very strange times.
I'm not sure whether this question will be fair to you. I mean, because this is more political science kind of idea. So one of our international relations theorist name is Kenneth Walls. I mean, bless him. I mean, he's a brilliant scholar. So anyone learns about international relations or theories, they need to know about Kenneth Walls. So Kenneth Walls talked about, because during his time, there was a debate about, whether Iran should get nuclear weapons. And his idea was, why not? He was saying that if Iran or one or two other countries in the Middle East had nuclear weapons, that could have stopped any kind of warfare like the invasion from the West to the Middle East. Almost impossible, because there's a serious deterrence from there. So by having nuclear weapons, Middle East could have actually saved itself because it has got the deterrence. And his idea about, the things you talked about, the rational actor, and the nuclear weapons are inherently deterrence. It's not offensive weapon. So his idea is, if Iran or any other countries have nuclear weapon, just deal with it the way you dealt with North Korea. They have one, but you try to stop it, but you couldn't stop it. And then what can you do? Just deal with that and then sleep well. So that was his wordings he was using. I mean, what do you think about that philosophical understanding about, our humanity?
I think it's really interesting, and I can understand his perspective from a lens of deterrence. Of course, let's not forget Israel has nukes, so the Middle East already has,
Mm,
a space that is to some extent subject to nuclear deterrence, and but I think I think it's a very fight fire with fire approach, isn't it? And I feel as though when you're dealing with something as lethal that can
mm,
cause such extensive civilian casualty, which of course contravenes the Geneva Convention, then we really should be taking a step towards disarmament,
mm,
towards having fewer nuclear weapons in the world, and towards having a kind of smaller nuclear presence.
mm,
I think there's a big question to be asked there around the notion of a responsible custodian and who has nuclear weapons and who doesn't.
mm,
For example, we can talk about India and Pakistan, who are not considered to be nuclear weapon possessor states
mm,
in the kind of sanctioned, authorized, international, legitimate sense. Of course, they have nuclear weapons. Of course, they are, as much as you ever can be when you have lethal weapons of mass destruction. They are responsible custodians.
mm,
Um, and arguably, the presence of nukes in Pakistan and India may well have prevented all-out war. So
mm,
it's really difficult. A lot of it is to do with scale, though, and so I suspect that you would have still had war in the Middle East, regardless of Iran possessing nuclear weapons, um, because it's also about scale as well, and a likelihood of attack. And I think there would have still been an issue regardless. I think that there would have still been the challenges that the Middle East faced. It's really interesting though to think about, isn't it, as kind
mm,
of a political question. I guess I don't really know enough about Middle Eastern politics to give you a really, really good
mm,
answer,
mm,
but
mm.
it's very interesting to contemplate.
One of the things, like I like show this film in my class, Stanley Kubrick's Doctor Strangelove, about
Mm,
um and it always fascinates me, this film. I mean, it's obviously amazing script, amazing acting and everything. I think like some of the directors were saying that when they were young, when they watched this film, when they came out from the cinema hall, they thought that, is it a film, or it almost looks like kind of documentary they've watched, you know? um so two things here, like one of this, like the way the nuclear technology intersected with that, the cyber security and all those signs.
mm.
I mean, how bulletproof is that? Because that's the thing, is like, if there is a false alarm, if there is something, some kind of disruptions, like, do you think you can touch some of those things?
That's a really good question, actually. We've had a number of false alarms through history. As you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't quite a false alarm, but there's been multiple scenarios where we thought perhaps we were being attacked, and then it was serendipity that intervened and made sure that we didn't respond. And I think in the context of things like generative AI and the use of AI systems, we may increase that risk in future of false alarms. And it could go either way, though, because the way I see it is that the technologies that we're getting may be really good for safeguarding, but they're only as good as the material that they have to analyze. They're only as good as whatever they're given. And what they understand. And even the best AI system will have unexpected spaces of misunderstanding that we're not aware of yet. And then, of course, we've always got human error. We've always, with technological error goes human error hand in hand. So I think I think thinking forward, and you're right, I love Stanley Kubrick. I think he's amazing. And my students also watch Dr. Strangelove, How I Learned to Love the Bomb. So because I think it's an important part of understanding the kind of satire and the culture of the time, and how these these generals and the like were kind of perceived by film directors and therefore by the public. But yeah, I think it's very very interesting when we think about technology, kind of where we're going, and what might happen. I mean, we are at that point now where it's speculative, but I think the possibility of systems being hacked is going to increase, and of cyber warfare, particularly in the nuclear context, will increase as well, even if we have air-gapped technology, because I'm pretty sure we'll have remote technologies that will be able to allow us to, change that dynamic in the near future. So that's something I'm very interested in. I think the intersection between cybersecurity and nuclear warfare is fascinating for me, because so much warfare has been like beyond the battlefront, has been psychological, it has been online, it has been through kind of a medium of technology, and I think that there's in the context of nuclear warfare, I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on through computer games at the moment, actually. So if we look at things like the new Stalker that's coming out, right? Ukrainian computer game. It's really Ukraine nationalist. If we look at the new BioShock again, if we look at not Fallout, but Call of Duty, that's the one I meant. There's they use a version of Call of Duty now, don't they? During the recruitment process the US Army does. So there's this kind of the air gap between the kind of simulated and gaming is becoming smaller and smaller, and the movement between people across the two domains is becoming smaller and smaller. So we're finding that people from the games industry are being recruited to the military. People from the military, they go retire to the games industry, if they work in kind of that simulation space. And I think that's really, really interesting, because of course, where do we draw the line? How do we understand, these technologies, and how do we engage with them? Like, if we're playing at nuclear war every day, does that diminish its power to affect us? If we're, if we're thinking about, if we're all chatting away about nuclear security online, does that amplify or diminish its seriousness and importance? Do we how do we make sure that there is still kind of that nuclear warfare retains the special significance that it's had over the past decades in a world that is so much more almost egalitarian in a maybe in a positive way, no, maybe in a negative way. It's quite interesting. And then, of course, when these technologies go from military spaces to gaming spaces, let's say, how do we protect? Because I think it's a very serious and very interesting question that if we are aware of and using, and people are developing games and technologies and things like Nuke Map, how do we ensure that when we do things like prepare for civil defence, how do we ensure that the public actually have an accurate understanding of what might happen in a nuclear war, opposed to kind of what they've garnered from Fallout and Nuke Map or any other fun thing that's out there to play with. So there's loads of angles, I think, beyond kind of cybersecurity and nuclear warfare, going to just security, preparedness, emergency planning, and nuclear warfare. There are a lot of interesting questions out there to think about.
Like my experience with you is like you're extremely a positive person. I mean,
Thank you.
so like my another philosophical question would be, can you envision the planet without nuclear weapons in our lifetime?
Yes, I think it will be slow. I think it will be gradual. But we've had, if we just reflect on the last 50 years, politics has changed dramatically. Our allies have evolved, and And there might be, there might be a unilateral shift. I don't think it's going to be the early part of my lifetime, but maybe in the late part of my lifetime, there might be a change in attitude. But also, I mean, we have to bear in mind that some technologies just phase themselves out anyway. We don't use bayonets in warfare. We don't use horses in the same, you don't use the things that we used during the First World War, because we have better options. And it may be that we reach a point where we recognize we have better options, that there are better ways to do things, that we don't need nuclear weapons anymore. So that's the point that I hope that we reach. But until then, I think they're here to stay. And it takes time as well for kind of treaties to percolate through and to become part of the norm. So give it time. I work very closely with ICANN, who are the International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, who won the Nobel Prize in 2017. And I'm really excited, actually, because we're collaborating and working together, University of Bradford and ICANN, and we're going to be having a disarmament symposium for interdisciplinary scholars. So anybody from a physicist to a philosopher is welcome, on the 13th and 14th of December 2024, and it would be amazing to hear from you. So get in touch if that's something you want to engage with. So ICANN have been instrumental in kind of pushing for that change, and they've done it in a very different way to previous organisations. So they've gone through the policy route. We get on our suits, we go out, we talk to policymakers, and we push for change.
I just want to touch like something personal. Like you are a photographer.
Yes.
Tell us about your photography, this passion and how it plays in your day-to-day thing, because we all need our head space, like calm, cool. I do a bit of photography myself, but not in any kind of professional setting or anything. It's just like my hobby, and it gives me joys, try to work on those photos. Tell us about your, because I think you mentioned about your grandparent was a photographer, famous photographer. Tell us your journey as a like photographer.
I love that you're a photographer too. I just think there's so much power and beauty in the capacity to capture a moment, right? And I was really privileged. So most people don't grow up with a camera in their hand, but my granddad photographed professionally, and he used to get lots of new cameras. And then when he was done with an old camera, he'd give it to me. So literally, I had my first camera at the age of 4. And I haven't stopped since. And I think I probably knew what F values were before I knew what politics was. And so I really love my camera, and photography for me is a way of connecting to my family and connecting to my granddad. We share photos, we send each other books about photography. So it's a really important thing to me as far as my heritage and my family's concerned as well. But I love the fact that it gives you that capacity to document a moment in time. And I personally, I am very much a documentary photographer, so I love to photograph people and places and events. And if you ever want a good portrait, next time you're down here, I am your woman, basically.
Thank you.
And I've just been very lucky. I've had some. I've had some really interesting opportunities photography wise, while I've done my field work, I photographed in Japan, Fiji, the US, Kiribati, as well as the UK. But it's something that is a great source of pleasure for me as well, because I think we need to be creating archives as academics of kind of what it is like and what it means to be an academic now. And I feel as though our digital age and the kind of disposability of phone photos make it less likely that we're going to kind of record things as they are. There's only so many selfies with your peace sign up that we need, right? And so I feel it's a real privilege as well to understand how cameras work and to like get out there and photograph my friends, photograph our lives, and I've done a lot of weddings as well over the years. for friends. I specialize in LGBTQIA weddings if I do wedding photography. And I get asked. So once you've done a few, you get asked. So yes. So that's which has been a real pleasure for me, because I love anything that's a celebration of equality, a celebration of love, a celebration of joy, So that's the other side of my photography that not everybody realizes.
So where you are heading for in terms of your research at the moment?
I'm very interested in kind of the preparedness aspects of work at the moment, and I think that's all I'll say for now. I think it'll be very interesting the next couple of years, because I've kind of finished some projects, starting new projects, and at that point now where I'm writing up and coming up with new ideas. So yeah, preparedness and technology are the spaces that you'll see me in.
One last question is for the future students who will be interested in your kind of field, nuclear geographer, or like, I'm not sure, like these are quite niche area. Universities don't provide this kind of very specialized degree. But if someone is interested, because I mean, the things you do, it's just so much,
Well, it all falls under peace, science and technology, which is the way forward, I think. So I'm hoping to develop and launch some peace, science and technology courses at Bradford in the future, fairly soon. So watch this space. And it won't just be nuclear, because while I've focused on the nuclear because of my background and my interest in knowledge and things like kind of health physics, nuclear physics and similar, actually my interest in technology is really broad. So I think it would be amazing to have that course that kind of covers everything from environmental threats to chemistry to biohazards to nuclear risk to cyber warfare, and look at the science and technology studies of it, not just kind of consider the science. I think there's a lot more, and I think that we need to be scientifically and politically literate kind of going forward. So that's my dream, is to create a new generation of peace studies students who can do a little bit of everything.
So like I can stop the recording, unofficially.
Okay.
So thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. I just hope I was okay and that I wasn't too like blah, blah, blah.
No, I learned so many things from you. You were very special. You're very special, Becky.
So kind of you. Thank you.
You write extensively as well. So I just like searching your name, and then the amount of things you wrote for mainstream newspaper, from Telegraph to Independent to the Conversation.
Tell my department to promote me, because I just got turned down for promotion.
Amazing.
And I've got more publications than the profs.
No, you are a prolific writer, and then the way you write, I think it's just so. I will use your style, the way you things in my classes, and I'm thinking of I'm thinking of like bringing you to one of my classes, just to as a guest speaker, because I teach United Nations politics. So like one of the sessions you can where you can talk about.
I'd love to do that. That sounds so fun. I'd be totally up for that. And just thank you so much. Like, it's been a real pleasure and lovely to see you again.
Thank you. Okay, you take care today.
Yeah. Have a lovely weekend. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.